put this in a little further perspective, the Okun's law has a different name among heterodox economists. It's called the Kaldor-Verdurin effect among heterodox economists. And basically it has to do with Kaldor and Verdurin's observation that in growth situations, Verdurin was particularly interested in what was going to happen in the recovery of the European economies after the Second World War. There is a tendency for employment in a growing sector to grow more slowly than real output measured by value added. And that relationship, obviously, if you turn it around, also means that productivity is increasing, will increase under those circumstances. And that Kaldor thought that was a sufficiently widespread phenomenon that he actually based his theory of economic growth around this idea that demand-led increases in output would lead to endogenous increases in productivity, which of course completely inverts the way that that's usually viewed by mainstream macroeconomists. So I'm still very puzzled about this. And let me put it just in another perspective, which I think is interesting. Tom Michael and I, in our book Growth and Distribution, set up this general framework for looking at macroeconomics, where you look at the production possibility frontier of the economy in terms of a linear graph between in which the vertical axis measures productivity of labor or the wage, and the horizontal axis measures productivity of capital or the profit rate. And you can draw a straight line between the current productivity of labor and the current productivity of capital. We were interested in this largely because of long-term, an interest in long-term patterns of economic growth, which in many industrialized countries has what we call a Marx-biased pattern, which is that the productivity of labor rises while the productivity of capital falls. So this this line twists around a point in the positive quadrant. When I was looking at data about this, which I showed to some of my students in advanced political economy, I made little movies of it from the Penn World Tables data, where, you know, like a time-lapse animation where you could watch this curve move around over time. And you do definitely see in countries like the US, Japan, mostly European countries, industrialized countries, you see this twisting Marx-biased technical change is very prominent. But you also notice business cycles. And what you notice in business cycles is a very, very different pattern. Because in business cycles, what happens is that the whole line just moves in parallel to itself. In other words, labor productivity and capital productivity fall by about the same proportion in the business cycle. Or to put this another way, the business cycle is Hicks neutral. It looks like it's Hicks neutral, a Hicks neutral phenomenon, in that the productivity of both labor and capital are affected in the same way. This has a connection to mainstream macroeconomics of the Chicago real business cycle view, because it's clear that what they do is they see the same phenomenon of the inward movement, Hicks neutral inward movement that's associated with business cycle downturns, and they call that an exogenous total factor productivity shock. Okay, so from their point of view, that's what is at the root of the whole thing. It's not financial crisis or the malfunction of asset markets or anything like that. It's that for some mysterious reason, every once in a while, total factor productivity in the economy undergoes this inexplicable retreat, and then they work out through the intertemporal stochastic optimization theory what the response of the economy might be to those kinds of shocks, and try to treat that as a theory of the business cycle. Well, suppose we now look at this current crisis from this point of view and take account of the point that Peter Scott mentioned. In this particular crisis, labor productivity is not falling. And that's why my projection is wrong and why the Okun's law relationship has broken down. What's happened is that it's the inverse of a jobless recovery. In this case, it's an output fall-less crisis, or almost output fall-less crisis, a relatively small decline in real GDP for the really quite substantial and very dramatic fall in employment. So we're now, this suggests that if you looked at the, I haven't done this, now if our graduate students here were really on the ball, we would have the databases to do this in the computer, and I could just push a button and this would flash up on this.
You are not invited.
Yes, Laura probably does have this because she does this kind of thing all the time. But I suspect if you did the growth and distribution analysis for this crisis, you'll find that it's not a Hicks-neutral crisis. It's a Marx-biased crisis, and a very severely Marx-biased crisis, in which labor productivity is continuing to rise, measured labor productivity is continuing to rise, and capital productivity is falling sharply. Now, that's interesting to me because one of the things I learned from Marxian political economy is the idea that there are these kind of layers of understanding, and that things like financial crisis and asset bubbles and that kind of thing tend to be reflections of developments that are at a much more fundamental level in terms of things like productivity and I don't know what happened. Oh, they're expected. Okay. Nope, it's gone again. That are at a much more fundamental level and have to do with things like the organization of production, productivity, broader political economy trends. So if it's really true that this is a different, a very different pattern at this fundamental level of this crisis, I think that, to my mind, lends some support to Rick Wolf's strong feeling, which I tend to share, that this is not just an ordinary crisis that's going to turn around and go away with a Hicks-neutral recovery of total factor productivity, but that it reflects more fundamental problems in the organization of production. Let me just finish by saying one thing. There's always the possibility when you see an anomaly of this kind that's so sharp, that what's going wrong is not that there's a fundamental change in the way the economy works, but that there's something wrong with the statistics. And I have tried to follow that up. In particular, one might suspect that there's something wrong with the way we're measuring GDP. That has, the GDP has drifted away from its traditional correlation with real economic activity. I've tried to follow that up a little bit. For example, one difficulty is that about 2/3 of U.S. GDP is now service sector GDP, and only about 1/3 is actual production of goods, of material goods. And the way that GDP is calculated in the service sectors is rather interesting, because the way the service sectors work, the output is imputed, is what they call imputed, for almost all service sectors. What this means is that it's given a value equal to the incomes that are generated in the service sector. This means, for example, that when General Motors writes a bonus check to one of its executives, GDP does not go up. What happens is that the income is shifted from profit income to wage income. The GDP does not go up. On the other hand, when Goldman Sachs writes a bonus check, that directly increases GDP. Because that's the way the GDP works. And I'll just finish up. I think I'm in my 1 minute or something.